Hey, I'm Jared from EBMX. Today we're going through the X9000 app. This is a general overview. This is to suit different bikes and just to give you a run through of how this app works and how powerful it is. So to start off with, we have our main display. So this essentially shows you battery level, your motor temp, your motor power, and your motor RPM. If we scroll across to the right, we can see we've got some other information here. We've got our controller temps, phase current, throttle. So what you could do is screen record this and basically get some details off the bike. The other way is you have a full dash display. You could use this and mount this physically to your bike. This shows you a few parameters here. We've got obviously a lot of what we just talked about previously, but it will also show you some faults indicated with the throttles as well. But it's a good place to be, and if you do have like a phone mount, it's a really cool dash to use. Well as on this front display, here is if you did damage your SW102 display and you wanted to still run the bike, you would physically unplug the display. The display has to be physically unplugged from the bike for this to work. You could change your modes by clicking the mode button here. You can also change your, you could also change between race and street here as well, just by clicking. Moving over to settings, we've got general. Something to think about here is the bike that I'm connected to right now is a MX4 Talaria. Realistically, this is the naming convention. If you are setting up a custom bike, I would recommend you leave it as Talaria or a Suron Light B. You can use other as well, but generally how a lot of the code is written is that you can select one of these three bike types and then any motor will then connect to it via the app. So for instance, I can change it to a Light B. Any of these motors in this list here, I can select and the tune will load and it will work accordingly. So even though we do have that naming convention, just leave it as Suron Light B if it is a custom bike, but if it is a Talaria, an Ultra B, or like a Suron Light B, please select the correct bike type because there are some other internal settings we've loaded there. Looking at the motor types you can choose from, every tune here is literally written on a dyno, so we get at the loads of what that motor is capable of, the temperature sensors, etc. Then what we do is we literally fit that motor to a bike. We then literally write a custom tune. We give it to people around the world. We get a lot of feedback. We then keep changing the tune, and that is basically what you see here. So when you select a tune here, what happens is a motor XML loads into the controller, and that then becomes the tune. And every time you load a motor XML, you'll always need to then calibrate the motor. So like I said, any of the motors here you can select. We've custom tuned, we've ridden them ourselves, we are riders. It's basically a really set tune designed to run on these bikes correctly. Moving down in the app, we have our battery series. With the X9000, we kind of top out at 22S. This is essentially, if you have like a 21S or you had something like an 18S, what I would do is I would select the next series batteries up. So if you had a 21S, you would select a 22S battery and we could change that later in the controller calibrations page. In this case, it's a 20S battery in this bike. The other thing we have here is we've kind of limited our maximum current draw. So this is mainly for users that have stock bikes and we want to put some limits in place so they don't burn out any wiring. If you do have a custom battery, you would select unlimited. There is a passcode here you need to ask for, but that'll give you unlimited battery current depending what your application is. Moving down the app, we've obviously got our street mode and our race mode. Basically, you will set these current limits according to what you kind of want there. Generally for me, I just max everything out to 500 amps in my setups and what I use. I do have a capable battery and I do have obviously large connectors and looms, so it's safe for me to do so across the multiple bikes I have. You really want to be careful where you set this current and remember that the controller will generally clamp slower that current back than what the battery will. So if you set this to 240, you could peak at 260 or 270 for a split second before the controller will start clamping that current back. So if you are worried about peak limits or overshooting, you need to set this lower than what you would think you'd need to. Moving down, you've got wheel diameter. This is basically measuring your wheel from the top of the tread to the bottom of the tread and putting that in as millimeters. And your gear ratio is what your final gear ratio is. If you don't know how to calculate your gear ratio, there was plenty of options online to kind of show you how to do that. Moving down, we have our temperature units. If you're obviously imperial or metric, these are all available. Same with your speed. And the other one here is your motor direction. This directly correlates to the sensor direction. So if your wheel is spinning clockwise and it's selected as clockwise, it doesn't mean the sensor isn't reading the motor position as anti-clockwise. So if the motor's spinning backwards, just click the opposite to what it is in the settings and save it, and you'll find that your motor will obviously roll in the right direction. Moving down the list, we've got our throttle page. So you can see here, this is basically where if you wanted to, if you did damage a throttle and you were running the thumb regen throttle like we are in this bike here, basically what you could do is you could turn it off, click save, and then where you've got your thumb throttle, you could literally change that to an accelerator for this instance. And this would then give you that option to then basically get you home by using this secondary throttle. Or, you only wanted to use the regen thumb throttle, you might be disabled or you might have a disability where it requires you to just use this side of the bike, or you prefer using a thumb throttle and you want to use this throttle as your regen. It gives you those options to physically change it. Or it might be something that you've got this controller in a go-kart or another application. It just gives you the ability to kind of choose what throttle you want or what you want to use the purpose for. Moving down from there, we have our off-throttle regen. That is basically when the throttle is released, a certain amount of regen will basically regen brake the motor. This is selectable. Just be careful on what battery you have fitted to the bike, whether it can take a high regen back in. Some batteries will not. If they're a small stock bike application, some will. 10% to 20% is a safe level to be if you're not sure about what your battery can take current-wise back in. Next up from this is ramping and curve. Ramping time is basically throttle sensitivity in milliseconds. Generally, I prefer this around 20 milliseconds to 10 milliseconds. It all depends on the application and what you're doing and what you've got it used for. Generally, the stock settings are designed to be kind of essentially slower so they're not over the top. So as you decrease the ramp time, your throttle will feel more sensitive. The other one is negative ramping time. This one basically controls your off-throttle response. I've never found a point in time where 10 milliseconds isn't correct. I know a lot of the street guys will kind of up this. They want the throttle to hang slightly longer, so they will increase it to 20 milliseconds, but 10 milliseconds has always been a happy place for me. Moving down from there, we've got input deadband. This is basically the amount of throttle. So if you're ever on a bike, you'll notice that as you move your hand and you got some bumpy terrain, the throttle will slightly move. So this is the part of the throttle that has no reaction before it starts to engage. So to give you an example, I can just twist the part of this throttle and the bike's kind of just kind of not moving. So that's what your input deadband is for. So raising that will mean more of the throttle is dead, but it also means you get a throttle that's less accurate as you raise it. 3% is a good place to be. If you have a 5-volt throttle like a Domino, raising that to 4 seems to be a better place to be, in my opinion. Coming down to throttle expo mode, this is basically the shape of the throttle curve. So we have 3 throttle curves. Normal is essentially a straight line. Polynormal is basically a tick, and exponential is basically kind of like a lump in the throttle curve. So normally the polynomial is generally the one to go for. That's what I think feels better. Expo is the other thing that kind of plays with how that throttle shape looks. Expo basically means that the 0 to 100 point happens sooner in a tick shape or in a curve shape. So expo at 0.5 to 1 is a place where I like to be for most of my setups. You might want to lessen that. Definitely worth playing with. Next up is our peripheral setup. This is basically if you want to run the bike's kickstand sensors, the tilt sensors, etc. It also runs through basically our DC to DC controller that's inside the X9000. So if you have a full-size bike and a water pump or something like that, you can basically turn it on here. You also can control your headlight directly from the SW102. And basically with the SW102 wired into the headlight, you would just hold down on the SW102 and it will activate the headlight as long as it's wired and this input is set. You can also go through this and look at your coolant pump start temperatures. So you have a target temperature when you want that to start, because obviously you don't want your pump running all the time, you're drawing battery. It might be a bit of a colder environment where you don't want things to be that cold. So you would have a set temp where you want that pump to start. That way the pump's not running all the time and there's no inefficiency there. You'll see there's another heading called Diagnose. If you jump into this one, this is just to kind of see what's working in the bike or if you do have any faults. A good one that I've kind of found like fairly regularly is with a lot of encoder motors that we don't have a PWM signal, and it's because it isn't physically connected. So if you look in this app, for instance, you'll see you've got encoder PWM, and you'll physically see as I spin the wheel of this bike, we can see that changes to 0 to 1. So we know that we do have PWM and we know that our ABZ is working correctly or our ABI is working correctly. Generally, you would use this for essentially logging or checking if you had any faults or see what was wrong, but it's a good place to come into first if you do have a fault on the display. It also tell you what the fault code is. So it's a good place to kind of jump into to start with. Next up, we have modes and levels. At the very top, it says mode after restart continue. All that means is if I had the bike in race mode, and I physically turn the bike off, when I start it back up again, it will start in race mode. But you can also select in here whether it only ever starts in street, and then you physically have to change it, or if it only ever starts in race. So generally, continue is where I would normally leave it, but most of the time we'll just be in one mode and that's kind of it, but that's where you would change it here. On top of that, you have 2 headings. You have street and race, and these are your 2 settings. So you obviously have 3 power modes in two different settings. So in street, if we look through our power modes, this is basically the peak level. Now this is controlled by the current you set previously. So if you set 100 amp DC at 20S and then you set 20 kilowatt here, you're never going to hit 20 kilowatt peak because you're going to be limited by the DC amps you put in. So just remember that whatever you match as your peak current limit is going to be the peak power limit that you put in here. These are simple to sliders, and same with anything in this app. If you can't get the slider where you want it, literally click on it and you can physically type it in. On top of that, moving down, you've got your motor phase current. So motor phase current is always your starting torque and probably your lower to mid RPM torque. Once we kind of get up into the motor RPM band, those phase amps, those peak values you set aren't important. You will not pull 1000 phase amps at 8000 RPM. You'll pull 1000 phase amps at a lower RPM, and it's always going to be your starting torque. Phase amps induce a lot of motor heat. So remember that if you do have a smaller motor and you are getting a lot of motor heat, the two things that correlate with motor heat is going to be your phase amps and your field weakening. So if you do need to reduce your motor heat, they're going to be an issue there. So once again, these are sliders. You can literally click and type in what you want, for instance, and it will just load up here. The other one is reverse strength. This basically relates to how much power will be put into the bike reversing when you are in reverse. You can make this on a sliding scale. Somewhere between 80 or 90 feels pretty natural to me. I like it to be very similar to what I would be in mode 1. It's just makes, if you have it at 50%, the throttle kind of feels a little bit doughy. And if you are on a hill, I find the reverse at 50% is too weak to use it. So it needs to be somewhere above 80% generally. Moving through the rest of the race mode here, we've got our thumb throttle. This is basically our regen strength via our regen brake. So depending on the battery you have, if you have a stock BMS battery, 35% will always be the max you can put through this. Otherwise you will trip the BMS on charging. If you have an aftermarket battery, basically you can run this to 100%. Just double check if you do have a custom battery that wasn't supplied by EBMX that you might be able to run this at 100%. So generally, if you're riding on the street, I will find this 100% really good. It's a really good brake, and that's kind of it. Next one down is our speed limit. This directly relates to the top speed limit that we've kind of set in the bike. Basically, I would recommend that in race that you max this out. And when you come over to street, you get all the same settings again that we just went through in race. Same with the thumb throttle, but your speed limit here is kind of important. If you're an enduro rider and you want all the same power settings, but you don't want the bike to just run away on you, this is where you would reduce the speed limit, but keep, your 1000 phase amp settings and your 20 kilowatt, etc. You would keep it here. It's really, really handy and kind of a good thing to play with. Coming into controller calibrations, this is, as it says, calibration. So from here, we can obviously set up our twist throttle, which is our acceleration throttle. We can also set up our thumb throttle here. If you are running a custom throttle or you are running something different or you want to turn something off, kind of this is the place where you kind of start to calibrate things initially. Moving down, things like motor temp, like if you had a custom motor that you knew had a higher temperature than what we've set, you could actually change this here. You will need the passcode, but if you send us an email, we're more than happy to give you that passcode to change it. Moving through, we can also turn off our motor temperature sensor. So if you had a faulty motor temp sensor, you found that you could see it just going from 0 to 100 really quickly and you need to get back from a ride, this is another place where you would physically be able to turn this off. Same way, if you had a damaged Hall sensor and you wanted to just convert the same tune but into a sensorless mode, you could also turn this off here. We talked previously about field weakening. Field weakening basically gives us a higher top speed. It does produce more horsepower at the wheel, so it is good having field weakening on. It just depends how much. So if you have smaller motors, normally 60 to 75% is the place to be. If they're a lot smaller than the standard kind of Suron or Talaria platforms, you will not need to run it lower. But as far as larger motors, we would then obviously pump this up to 100%. Generally, the EBMX motors, any of the larger QS motors, I would always run this at 100% without any issues. But like I said, it all depends on motor heat. So as you wind this one up and you make more power and you're having way more fun, just remember that you kind of need to pull this back depending on your motor heat. Moving down here, we can turn slow voltage cutoff. So if you have a really laggy cylindrical cell battery, something that isn't a pouch cell that doesn't have as much voltage drop, you could obviously turn this on here. This will allow you to kind of full throttle, especially like something that I personally notice is as you have cylindrical packs and they get below 50%, that you might get the occasional cutoff with a high powered motor. So this is something that you would turn on here. Following that down, we've also got the encoder calibration. So once again, if you have a Hall sensor motor selected, this will come up as Hall calibration, but because we're on MX4 here, this now comes up written encoder calibration. So this is where you would physically calibrate the motor. And if you ever loaded a motor XML, after you've loaded it, you would then need to then run a Hall sensor or encoder calibration, and you would come into this section to do it. Restore encoder is basically what was set in the original motor XML. It'll restore it here. If you do have an encoder, generally they're always different because the sensitivity is so great. So you'd probably never use restore encoder. If you had something like a Suron with a Hall sensor, you could definitely use restore encoder if you had a bad reading. But generally, you would only restore it if you had an issue and you were trying to chase something, but I would generally recommend just run another in calibration. Restore encoder's there just in case you need it. We talked earlier about running a 21S battery, and we didn't have a 21S battery in there. Basically, a way to get around that is you would select 22S battery in the general settings. You would come over to here, and then you could physically change the voltage min and max here, and that would then allow you to run a 21S battery. Same if you had like an 18S battery, you would select a 20S setup. You would then physically change the min and max here. They are labeled as 20S, but at least give you that option. It may even be that the battery you have has a different chemistry, so the min and max voltages are different, and it still might be a 20S, but this then allows you to then have that option, so that way you're kind of not stuck to one battery type or one battery technology. It allows you to basically change it here. Coming out of controller calibrations, we also have firmware update. This is where you would actually update the firmware. You can also select a custom file from us. We'll give you the code, and that'll basically allow you to kind of jump in and select a custom firmware for your application. That is where you would do it here. If you had internet and you had service, obviously I have no internet here. If there is an update available, it will tell you to automatically update. Just be aware that every time you update or load new firmware on the bike, it turns it basically back to the stock configuration. So if you do have an Ultra B or a Talaria, you'll need to change the configuration again and basically run through the setup. Coming into advanced settings, you'll always need the code for this, and we'll give this out. Basically, in the advanced settings from here, you can import a custom motor XML. So if we've written a tune, but it isn't available in the app, you could load it here. Same with if you have a custom motor and you need to do an auto detection. So basically an auto tune, this is where you would start. We have essentially everything that you would need to kind of get a motor going and get a motor tuned correctly. This is what we use now in the field to tune. Originally we used the base VESC app, but we've moved on to using our own now. Everything essentially here that you would need to kind of tune a motor and go through the motor settings, everything from sensorless details. Obviously, if you want to see with a field weakening current, so with this motor, I can change the duty rate when this comes in. It kind of gives you that option to kind of do extra tuning. So if you reach out to us, we're more than happy to give you the password. It's just we like to know people know what they're doing, because in this menu, you can obviously blow up a motor and you can blow up a controller if you do click the wrong settings. And that's pretty much the overview of the EBMX X9000 app. Appreciate you watching. Any questions, let us know.